Welcome to the first Hope for Parents of Struggling Teens podcast. My name is Brandon Jaffe. With this podcast, my hope is that we can discuss relationship issues and mental health issues in a more helpful way than some of the conversations going on out there. And I'm hoping to kind of weed out some of the unhelpful trends in the industry of mental health and figure out what actually works in families and relationships and works in resolving some of that stuff that doesn't feel good in our heads, whether it's a diagnosis or not. Inspired Resolutions is a center that's dedicated to helping families with teens. So we are going to talk a lot about teen mental health, parenting, relationships, and of course, all the other relationship dynamics that take place in a home with teens. Anytime I'm working with a parent for the first time that has a teen who's struggling, or maybe the parent is struggling with a teen, I discuss putting the relationship first. And this is kind of a hard concept for parents to wrap their mind around. And most of them say, well, of course I put the relationship first. And I get it. And some of you listening right now may struggle with the way that I discuss putting the relationship first. But when you put the relationship first, the teaching, the nagging, the making sure that they don't do the wrong thing actually takes second place. What becomes more important is the way that you speak with your child. What becomes more important is being able to love on them during crisis moments or those really difficult times that you're having when you might even be resentful. It's funny because when I ask most parents what they wanted for their children when their child was born, most will say, well, I want them to be happy and successful, or some variation of that. And a lot of times what they don't really realize is that when they say they want their child to be happy and successful, they have some sort of a notion, maybe a more specific notion or a less specific notion, but they have some sort of a notion of what that is. And it's in line with what the parents' morals and values and idea of what success is. Right. And so not many parents, if any parents, say, you know, my little Johnny, I just want little Johnny to be really happy. And I don't care if he lives in my house till he's 60, smoking weed, not working. Right. We have this idea of what happy and successful is. And with that, with our fantasy of what we want for our children, the patterns start, right? Because our fantasies become so strong for our child, and we want to protect those fantasies when we want to protect our child. And that these fantasies actually sometimes begin these patterns that make it difficult to put the relationship first when it comes to parenting our children. Okay. And most parents think that they are putting the child first at least, and their future first at least. By the time a teen is a teen, they are responsible for their future and their happiness. They are more responsible for their decision making, and you've hopefully already given them the right and the wrong, and most, not all, but most of the lessons that you're actually going to give them in their lifetime. I know there's a lot of lessons into adulthood, but honestly, by the time they're a mid-teen, you have already given them most of the lessons. You've already modeled and preached and taught the things that are most important in terms of relationship and success in school and work, et cetera, faith, okay? And so, again, our fantasies often make it difficult to put the relationship first because we become attached to that. And when we see it going awry, we want to protect what we wanted for our children rather than just protecting the relationship. Another reason it's difficult is we fall into these kind of patterns that don't put the relationship first because of pressures in society and the community. We allow our fears to dictate our parenting. And then we sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves, we even let our ego get in the way of putting the relationship first. As our children grow and they become teenagers, their charm goes away. The cuteness of when they were a child wears off. And so this buffer goes away. And so with the fear for their future and for their happiness also comes some resentment and frustration that kind of swirls around in there and then becomes a part of the decision making when we're parenting as well. And I don't just mean decision making like, hey, do we set a certain boundary or not? I mean the decision to speak a certain way, the decision to use different tones or body language, or maybe even shut off completely and not speak to the child, right? And so when we make these small decisions and big decisions, we don't want our fear to get in the way. We don't want our frustrations and the resentments to be a part of how we decide to behave towards our children. And that's kind of the key, right? In terms of how we're doing relationship. It's how are we behaving towards that person during crisis, during good times, during bad times. And so one of, I think, hiccups or the blocks for parents when I discuss putting relationship first is that they think that means you've got to be a pushover. They think that means you've got to make the teen happy at all times. And that's just not true. Okay. At Inspired Resolutions, we say put the relationship first in parenting, but that does not mean that you can't set healthy boundaries. In fact, putting the relationship first does mean that you have healthy boundaries in place. And in this podcast, we're not going to speak too much on the healthy boundary setting as a parent, but there is an unhealthy and a healthy way to set boundaries. And as long as you're setting healthy boundaries that you actually control, you can do both. You can put the relationship first while setting boundaries. Remember, when you are putting the relationship first, you are not pleasing them all the time. It simply means you're doing what's healthy for the relationship in the long run. And I usually want the parents to think about things like, what is the tone that you are using when you're happy, when you're mildly frustrated, or when you feel like you're in crisis and your child is making all the mistakes in the world? What is your demeanor as you navigate through the day during your interactions with them? Are you able, this is kind of a funny one, are you able to set a boundary even though you're afraid that they're going to be angry with you, right? Because setting a healthy boundary is putting the relationship first. Sometimes putting the relationship first in the long run means allowing them to have their negative feelings towards you without taking it personally. Okay, so what is your tone? What is your demeanor? Are you able to love on them unconditionally, even when it's really difficult to love on them and you're not getting it back? Do you participate in their anger and their hate speech when they become unreasonable? Or are you able to step back and not participate in the insane conversation and recognize that, hey, they're a teen. Right now, they need to experience maybe even loving behavior, but at least calm, cool, collected behavior because they can't control themselves. And even though I already said this one, I think this is really important because a lot of parents forget that they are the parent and the child is the child. That is not an equal relationship. Your children are not going to be able to love on you the way that you are supposed to love on them. Okay? They aren't going to reciprocate it. Maybe I usually tell parents, wait until they're 30. Hopefully by the time they're 30, they're going to be on a good track. They'll be able to kind of be in an adult relationship with you. And by then they'll be able to reciprocate that kind of love if you protected the relationship and put the relationship first day after day, week after week, year after year. Okay? But please don't take it personally. Their brains aren't fully developed yet, believe it or not, okay? They don't have the ability you should have to control their emotions, to take a step back and behave well when things become difficult or scary or feel unfair. And so if you're not taking it personally, that is putting the relationship first. If you're able to allow them to have their wild, angry, frustrated feelings, even though they don't deserve to have them, and you think that what they want or what they are saying is totally off base, that is putting the relationship first. And remember, you don't have to give in. You're loving on them by allowing them to have the feelings. You don't love on them by giving them everything that they want. When you have healthy boundaries, you don't need to participate in the insanity and the insane conversations. You know that you can rely on the follow-through of the things that you actually control with a cool, calm demeanor. Calm parenting is best. Please understand that. Your kids can know that you're angry, but they don't have to observe the yelling, maybe the cussing, the putting them down, okay? Just because you're putting the relationship first does not mean that your child is going to reciprocate that love. And again, I've said this several times in a row. I know, don't take it personally, okay? So even though they can't reciprocate all the time, be consistent in all situations. And remember that your job is to influence your child in the long run. Now, some of the situations that come up that are kind of difficult, become kind of difficult to love on your child and put the relationship first, is when you've maybe been telling them day after day, you got to do your homework, and you have been working with the school and maybe even doing way more than they are to get them the grades and get them to do the work that they need so that they're successful in life, so they can end up going to college. And then they fail out of like 3 or 4 classes, or maybe they fail all of their classes, and they come home and they don't even care, right? You're tapped out, most likely. It's going to be really hard for you to love on them. It's going to be really hard in that moment for you to put the relationship first, because you have been doing more work than them. You didn't set boundaries. You didn't say, hey, this is their journey. Okay. You did all this work to try and get them to do well in school, and they still failed, and you might build a resentment about that. And so you got to take a step back. You're not happy. I don't think that you should condone that they're not doing well in school, but remember, their journey is their journey. Your parenting journey is your parenting journey. You are there to provide help. You're there to provide resources. You're there to put the relationship first, to love on them unconditionally. You are there sometimes to teach, but sometimes it is your job to allow them to fail without damaging the relationship. Okay? And so your child fails, you're ticked off because you have put so much work in trying to get them to be okay. They say they don't even care, and you're going, oh my gosh, what is wrong with my kid? They don't even care that they just might have ruined their entire future. And then you speak to them poorly, and instead of loving on them and allowing them to be maybe bummed at themselves or angry with themselves, you're angry with them and you're laying in them. That is not putting the relationship first. Now, I'm all for healthy boundaries, right? I don't know that I want, if my child didn't do their homework because they were up till 4 a.m. every night on their iPhone, I might not be willing to pay for that iPhone anymore. Or I might set boundaries regarding using the iPhone that I am providing them, as long as I focus on what I control and I keep the attitude of I'm protecting myself. Now, remember, all boundaries are about protecting yourself. Most parents think that boundaries are about changing your child. That gets all messed up, and I'm going to talk about that in another episode. But when you put the relationship first, you're able to love on them. You haven't given more than you have to give. You might be angry, but you're not resentful. And so in this case, I have kind of a cool story. I've had this exact situation over and over again in my office over the years, but I remember one specifically. And the child came home and said, hey, I failed a couple of classes. And what the parent did was really interesting. They said, I am so sorry. That is really difficult. Why don't we go get your favorite meal? If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it. If you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to talk about it. And you just let me know how I can help next time. Now, it's interesting because in working with this family, I know that they had begun to set certain boundaries on things that were getting in the way of this child doing what they needed to do for school. But I loved this because the parent, when they're telling me about this story, said that very short, I can't remember if it was the next day or later that night, but the kid came to her and said, hey, I know that I need to do this and that. I need to get rid of my phone. They basically went to the parent, gave them themselves the consequences that the parent would normally have given them. And it was just mind-blowing to the parent, because the parent had just kind of released the whole, I'm going to punish them. They really had made the decision not to take anything away, just to try to love on them, because all the semesters before that this had kind of happened, nothing had worked. right? Now remember, there is a very important rule at Inspired Resolution. That's if it's working, keep doing it. If it's not, stop. But so this parent had done all the rewards and the punishments and the bribing and the nagging and the teaching, and none of it had worked. And so they decided to put the relationship first, be able to love on that child in this moment, recognize that it was probably hard for that child. And the result was quick. The results aren't always quick, but in this case, the results were really quick. And this child basically punished themselves, had a whole different attitude. Now, I'm not going to say that school was all of a sudden perfect and this was the end of the road and the happily ever after. But I will tell you this moment in this family's life, in this parent-child relationship was a major turning point. And this child began to change their relationship on that night, on that day. Okay. Now, again, there were the ups and downs, and sometimes the parents got a little frustrated and had a hard time in a relationship first, but overall, both of them made a substantial change. And after a few years, the relationship they had with their child was unrecognizable in a good way. It was amazing. And it's one of my favorite stories of a decision where a parent decided to do something different that went against what society would tell them to do, what maybe teachers would tell them to do. And so it's just mind-blowing that one decision was the catalyst for many, many, many changes in the next few years. Okay. Another time that it's really difficult to love on your child and to put the relationship first is when they are treating you terribly. When they're going off on you and you're just trying to be a good parent, and maybe you even did something nice, but they didn't get everything that they wanted. And so when they treat you terribly, it's really hard to put the relationship first. Now, set your boundaries. I do not believe that parents should allow their children to abuse them. I'm not saying you need to just sit there while they're going off on you. Set boundaries. I don't think you should interact with them. I don't think you should be doing favors for a child who's flipping out on you, treating you really poorly. But do not treat them poorly back. And it might be that you do some sort of a gesture like, hey, I'm not sticking around for this, but I need you to know that I love you. That's putting the relationship first. It might be that you step away, they're flipping out, they're like a gorilla in the zoo, and then you, the next morning, send a small message saying, hey, we're having a tough time, but I want you to know how much I love you. Or it might be that in the midst of all this, they do one good thing and you're able to tell them, hey, I'm really proud of you for that one thing, even though they've been treating you poorly. Now, I know some of you are saying, yeah, but if I do that, they're just going to snap back at me because they hate me so much. And I get that. But do these things consistently. And what I've seen is when parents can do this, both keep the boundaries so you don't keep yourself in a situation where they're abusing you, but you also don't participate back. And then you almost wake up each day willing to love on them. And you make little gestures of loving on them, even if they're not giving you many opportunities. But what I've seen is that with consistency in that, the entire relationship changes. It turns around. More often than not, it turns around, but the consistency in it is key. You can't just try it for a week or 2 weeks or a month and then come back to me and say, oh, see, I tried it your way. It just doesn't work. My child's terrible. I'm talking about consistency in the long run. And you'll hear me say this a lot on podcasts and such, but I want parents to prepare for a positive relationship with their child when they're 30. I want you influencing your child. I don't want you taking responsibility to change or take on their journey. I want you to be in their lives in a way that is loving even when they can't love you. And that is so difficult when they start treating you terribly. Okay? Now, the next situation that it can be difficult to put the relationship first is when they do something terrible, whether it be stealing drugs, something like that, get arrested. And again, I would remind you that putting the relationship first means that you recognize there are going to be consequences that they suffer. So don't enable, because enabling is not putting the relationship first. That's putting a whole lot of other unhealthy things first. So don't enable them through these terrible decisions that they make, but don't abandon them either. I'm not saying that you've got to pay for their bail every single time they get arrested, if they get arrested all the time, or give them money when they're using it for weed. Set the boundaries in a cool, calm way, and always make gestures of love. Put the relationship first. Being in relationship first comes before giving them the lesson or giving them the consequence. And in fact, a lot of the consequences should just come naturally from boundaries, not because you're trying to change their behavior. And that's a hard concept to wrap around, and we'll be talking about that a lot. Okay? But when they do something terrible, oh man, it is hard to love on them. It is hard to put the relationship first. You just want to teach them because you want to protect them from having a horrible life. We don't want them ending up on the streets or in drug rehab centers or in prison for the rest of their life. And we want to change that. But remember, a child who's making terrible decisions but has an amazing relationship with their parent is more likely to be influenced in the long run by the time they're 30 by their parents. A child who is exhibiting a lack of morals, empathy, and values that the parents have taught. I can't tell you how many times parents say, I didn't teach them to be this way. I'm going, well, you're not done raising them. They're teens. But if that child sees their parents as being happy, even when they're not able to be happy, if they see their parents as somebody that they can be in relationship, even when they're making really bad decisions or behaving poorly, what happens is in the long run, as they become adults, they take on your morals and your values because they go, hey, that works. And what I was doing before doesn't work. Okay. The fourth situation that it can be hard to put the relationship first is when there's mental health issues. And this one's hard because it's hard to navigate. It's a lot of parents want to walk on eggshells because they don't want to make worse the mental health issues. Now, I'm here to say that I haven't seen mental health issues that where it's good and prudent to walk on eggshells, enable, or make sure that you don't make them feel bad because you're exhibiting healthy relationship practices. Now, sometimes healthy relationship practices means boundaries, like I've said. Sometimes it's loving on somebody. Sometimes it's modeling something. Sometimes it is changing the dynamic of how you interact with them so that you can be healthy and they can be healthier. And so when they have mental health issues, definitely get them resources, definitely be mindful and be willing to discuss or take some advice from a professional in terms of how to set things up or help them. However, don't take responsibility for their mental health issues. That is not putting the relationship first. Okay? Putting the relationship first when they have mental health issues is walking alongside them while you're taking care of yourself and you're making sure that you're okay, and kind of becoming that rock that they can come to. You're a model of health and happiness walking alongside them. You're not following them down into the depths of their turmoil and their crisis. And again, if following them down and ruining your whole life to make their mental health issues better worked, I'd say do it. But I've seen time and time again over the years that fails. Right? I can't tell you how many parents come in and they find themselves resentful towards their child who's struggling with mental health issues because they've tried everything and their kid won't do what it takes to fix themselves. But then they vacillate between, I'm going to enable them and I don't want to trigger them. And then I am angry and I can't stand to be around them. And then I'm going to enable them and I don't want to trigger them. And so that kind of back and forth is not putting the relationship first. Putting the relationship first means doing what is healthy in relationship, even when the other person is either struggling or attacking you or having some sort of a hard time. Putting the relationship first actually means taking care of yourself, your emotional well-being, your physical well-being while walking alongside them. It doesn't mean sacrificing your being okay. So this conversation could go on forever, and I've kind of just hit on a few hot topics when it comes to putting the relationship first. And this concept of putting the relationship first is something that I am going to weave in and out of a lot of the podcasts that I do. And it is kind of one of the bases for, I guess, foundations for a lot of the concepts I talk about when it comes to family mental health. So thank you for joining me for this first podcast. I hope it was helpful, and I'm excited to meet you again in the next one.